Appendix: Athenian education during the classical period, 450 to 323 BCE. Education of Athenian citizens during the classical period was an intricate and extensive process. It was a professional undertaking which took place at a reliable location and consisted of literature, music, and physical fitness. The education of women differed considerably from that of men, with no physical fitness and less instruction and importance on music and literature. For boys, the educational venture started at age 7 and lasted until age 21, when they would officially become citizens. Advanced skills could be learned through an apprenticeship, while higher education was only available through traveling teachers until Plato founded the Academy in 386 BCE. Education in classical Athens was cultural and dealt with the training of character and citizenship rather than technical training that dealt with craftsmanship and profit. The Greek word paideia encapsulates Athenian ideals and means culture or education. The apex of Greek paideia comes from the word arete, which means the combination of proud and courtly morality with warlike valor. Arete developed from the quintessence of early Greek aristocratic education. Although the term can explain non-human things like godly power or the speed of horses, it is synonymous with leadership and embodies dominance and exceptional ability. For our purpose, the word is used to describe human merit and is the attribute of a true Greek nobleman. Greek paideia embodies human purpose and was the final justification for individual and community existence. Whether it be through anthropomorphic gods, the philosophies of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle that move the focus of thought from the cosmos to man, Homeric poetry whose focus is upon man, his destiny, and his gods, or the state which shapes man and his life, the center of paideia is man and his role in the universe. Paideia brought man to the center of Greek thought and taught citizens that the world was governed by definite and comprehensible laws. Due to recognition of these laws, Athenians had a tendency for creating universal patterns through inductive reasoning. They took isolated facts from a general conception and constructed it as part of a whole. Then, through the recognition of these universal patterns, the Greeks became aware of individuals in the community and discovered that these individuals were only part of an intricate whole. The realization allowed them to discover a universal principle of human nature: humanism. Humanism is derived from the Latin word humanitas, which means the process of educating man into his true form, the real and genuine human nature. At the core of Greek education is this humanism, and its aim is to create a higher man by having the recipients of its wisdom strive to leave the condition of their community in a better state than they received it. Paideia is an ideology and process that starts with an ideal, not with the individual. This is why we can justly say the history of what we can truly call civilization, the deliberate pursuit of an ideal, does not begin until Greece. State-supplied education didn't exist in classical Greece. This development wouldn't arise until the start of the Hellenistic period, when Alexander the Great died in 323 BCE. The Greeks saw the city-state or polis as the teacher of men. Greeks believed that it was culture itself, with its institutions, constitution, and laws, that educated individuals. This led the Greeks to feel a sense of common good or obligation to their polis over individual citizens. Athenians, both men and women, learned cultural norms, behavior, and knowledge through family and everyday life. In classical Greece, there are no public schools or universities, and education was a private affair. Education had to be paid for, but the cost was low since school teachers were generally despised. Those who could both read and write fluently achieved this proficiency through wealth. Only families who were rich enough could afford to pay private teachers who would instruct their children on how to read, write, train for athletics, and play a musical instrument. Children of poor families who couldn't afford the educational costs were lucky to acquire a high degree of literacy. Every citizen naturally learned from their polis, but advanced literacy for the poor would only occur if the parents, who needed to be literate, taught their children the necessary skills. Children could also find an apprenticeship to teach them such skills, but apprenticeships were usually reserved for learning advances or technical skills. For education, most poor Athenians had to depend on everyday experience and rote learning, which is memorization through learning by repetition. For those who could afford to pay, professionals set up schools and charged for their teaching services. The family, or more commonly, each boy had a slave that was a trusted family friend to assist during the school day. These humble slaves were highly respected, implicitly trusted, and addressed in every way as equals. The Greek designation for this honored slave was pedagogos, which means leader or the conductor of children. Boarding schools didn't exist, so the pedagogos would conduct the child to and from school while providing supervision. Teachers were generally despised due to their low status, but they were allowed to use corporal punishment for discipline, which usually occurred with a sandal. Punishment on behalf of the teachers occurred sparingly because their job was to teach, not discipline. Together, the teacher and pedagogos served as a double function. The teacher gave instructions on technical skills, while the pedagogos, spending much more time with the child than anyone else, acted as a moral instructor. The pedagogos was the capstone of Greek education and also acted as a leader, bodyguard, and tutor. Boys would be sent to school at age 6, and attendance would continue until they were 14 or 16, sometimes later if the family could afford it. The schools did not consist of desks, chairs, or chalkboards. There was only a bench where the pupil would sit while holding a scroll to read from and write on. Music was a part of daily life in ancient Greece. It was pervasive in every ritual, including social gatherings, births, deaths, and funerals. It included choral dancing as well as performing on instruments. It was believed that music had a profound impact on the mind. Musical ability, and more importantly, music appreciation, was attributed to having a balanced and controlled personality. Different modes of music were believed to induce different moods. The so-called Dorian mode, being seldom and martial, was thought to induce courage, whereas the Paideia mode, which was wild and perhaps atonal, was thought to encourage impetuosity. The focus and importance of music made it a fundamental part of every boy's education. Everyone learns to play the lyre, and much of the material of instruction is put into poetical and musical form. However, over the course of Greece's classical period, music seems to slowly lose importance, and there may be an explanation for this occurrence. Plato concluded, after philosophical examination, that music is inconsequential for education. The delineation of musical importance in Athens may be the result of Plato's scrutiny on the subject, coupled with his influence on Greek education, which will be discussed shortly. At age 16, each boy was expected to pay close attention to strenuous physical exercise and partake in the activity. Publicly funded buildings called gymnasia provided exercise facilities for daily workouts. Like the Olympic Games, exercising took place in the nude. The word gymnasium is derived from the Greek word gymnos, which means naked. The gymnasia also doubled as an informal educational opportunity for citizens to converse and exchange news and ideas. Athleticism was so significant that no Greek was considered educated that had not learned to wrestle, swim, and use the bow and the sling. This emphasis on physical fitness was essential because men from 18 to 60 could be called for military service. For those who could afford the fees, physical education could be taught by special teachers at the palastra, which was an ancient Greek wrestling room. The teachings would involve the basic sports practiced by Greece, which included running, leaping, wrestling, hunting, driving chariots, and hurling the javelin. These were not team sports, but rather individual athletic events that gave indirect military preparation. The proper use of words was taught through literature, and there is evidence for a normative approach to language in Plato and many other writers that shows a concern for proper terms, denotation, and procedure of words rather than just the most popular style at the time. Students who were taught literature started with writing and reading grammar, learning poetry by heart, understanding its moral content, and discussing literary questions. There was a large emphasis on mechanical exercises and rote learning. A large part of Athenian education for the average citizen was rote learning through plays and poems such as Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. The poets and dramatists were seen as teachers, not because their works were intentionally didactic, but rather because they contained oddments of knowledge and wisdom. Prose authors were not studied, nor were mathematicians or any technical subject. The usefulness of poets for instruction reflected their sheer educational practice, and they attained this position through their ability to assert moral value and instruction. During the 5th century, the capability of male citizens to read and write literature was taken for granted, which makes it difficult for us to determine how widespread literacy actually was. Nevertheless, many details are certain. Literacy in Greece was not just a craft skill only possessed by experts. Reading and writing was used for many purposes, such as shopping lists, displaying laws, poetry for lovers and enemies, and tombstone engravings. To be entirely illiterate was to be considered ignorant, dumb, and uncultured. It can also be said that there were many levels of ability in spelling, grammar, and writing. A definite figure would be hard to produce, but being cautious, we may say that in a city like Athens, well over half the male population could read and write. To put that in perspective, this means that levels of literacy in Greece cities of the classical and Hellenistic periods were higher than at any point in Western culture before the 20th century. Regardless of literacy levels, reading and writing were not required. Athens was a society that relied on oral means of communication. Therefore, the inability to read and write would not notably disadvantage the semi-literate or illiterate. There is, of course, no sign that women were expected or encouraged to read, though many could. The education of women was generally limited to domestic science and household arts because Athenians saw women as having an intellectual handicap. They were taught by their mothers or nurses to read, write, and reckon, to spin and weave and embroider, to dance and sing and play some instrument. This educational form was necessary because women ran the household. They were expected to clean the house or supervise its management, cook meals, spin wool, and make clothing and bedding for the family. Although they had forms of literature and musical education, women did not take part in public gymnastics. Advanced skills, such as public speaking, or technical skills, such as weapon making, were usually acquired by the children of aristocrats who could learn how to be successful in public life by observing the behavior of family members. Advanced or technical skills could also be acquired by securing an apprenticeship. An apprenticeship consisted of an older man committing to train a young boy in the predetermined area of study. To illustrate, I will briefly explain the life of a statesman's apprentice. The boy would observe the older man's interactions in public life and in the company of other men. When the sun was up, the boy would learn how to talk about politics or give speeches, help his elder in public office, and be an athletic training partner. When the sun went down, they would spend their night at a symposium where serious political and philosophical discussions would ensue, or they would occasionally party. The Greeks had a view of sexuality that modern historians still don't fully understand. Homosexual expressions of the loving bond between the teacher and pupil were normal. Although most men were married, these erotic relationships were a kind of a natural contest for status. Thomas Martin explains the relationship best. The eroticism of the relationship had to be played out as a kind of contest for status, with the younger man wishing to appear desirable but sufficiently in control to reject or modify his older pursuer's demands, and the older man wishing to demonstrate his power and ability to overcome resistance by winning a physical relationship with the young object of his pursuit. In general, homosexuality brought social disgrace and was frowned upon outside the apprenticeship relationship, but the activity was acceptable inside this social bond. The behavior was seen as appropriate as long as the mentor proceeded with his educational responsibilities and did not exploit the boy for physical satisfaction. This love is elaborately explained by Plato. I can see nothing better in life for a young boy, as soon as he is old enough, than finding a good lover, nor for a lover than finding a boyfriend. Love, more than anything, more than family or position or wealth, implants in a man the thing which must be their guide if they are to live a good life. And what is that? It is an honor of what is degrading and a passionate desire for what is good. These qualities are essential if a state or an individual is to accomplish anything great or good. Imagine a man in love being found out doing something humiliating or letting someone else do something degrading to him because he was too cowardly to stop it. It would embarrass him more to be found out by the boy he loved than by his father or his friends or anyone. And you can see just the same thing happening with the boy. He is more worried about being caught behaving badly by his admirers than by anyone else. So if there were some way of arranging that a state or an army could be made up of entirely pairs of lovers, it is impossible to imagine a finer population. They would avoid all dishonor and compete with one another for glory. In battle, this kind of army, though small, fighting side by side, would conquer virtually the whole world. After all, a lover would sooner be seen by anyone deserting his post or throwing away his weapons rather than by his boyfriend. He would normally choose to die many times over instead. With almost no exception, higher education was reserved for men and provided by professional teachers. Near the beginning of the classical period, around 450 BCE, a new type of self-proclaimed teacher came to Athens, offering organized instruction to boys seeking to be taught the skill of public speaking and argumentation. These instructors were called sophists, which is derived from the Greek word sophos, that means wise man. The sophists were men with similar cynicism, ethical justifications, love for money, and ostentatious intellectualism. They taught on traditional and arcane topics such as oratory, science, philosophy, history, mathematics, linguistics, antiquities, and anthropology. Their teachings also offered the power to command speeches, discussions, debates, and conversations. Only the wealthy could afford to be taught by sophists because they charged large amounts for instruction. In order to recruit attendants, the sophists would display elaborate shows and alluring demonstrations for young men by showcasing their ability to speak persuasively. Since Athens was predominantly an oral culture, the sophists were detested and feared while being daunting and frightening figures to challenge. They were incredible speakers and cultivated opposition to traditional ideas. They were seen as a threat because their power of speech seemed potentially destabilizing to political and social traditions. This is also the reason why their instruction was so highly sought after. These sophists were offering just what every ambitious young man wanted to learn, because the greatest single skill that a man in democratic Athens could possess was the ability to persuade his fellow citizens in debates of the assembly and the council or in lawsuits before large juries. Regardless of opinion, the sophist influence expanded the Greek ethos and provoked citizens to question the basic values of society, like the existence of gods and the duty to obey laws. They ushered in a new generation of politicians who were more sophisticated and skeptical. Opposition to the sophist teachings came in the form of an Athenian named Socrates. This early Greek philosopher offered no formal courses, charged no fees, and looked upon himself as a public servant. He made many conversationalists uncomfortable because he had the ability to leave his partner or opponent in a state of puzzlement. Socrates did this by picking out logical flaws in an argument, which usually involved applying close intellectual scrutiny to principles that were dismissed or assumed. This left the interlocutor admitting they were ignorant of their original premise. Oswin Murray does an excellent job of describing Plato's differentiation between the sophists and Socrates. They, the sophists, profess knowledge of all sorts. He, Socrates, professes ignorance. They parade skill in public speaking. He can only ask questions and rejects the elegant prepared answer. They offer to teach to make men better. He merely offers to confirm man's ignorance. They charge high fees. His teachings is free. The admittance of ignorance was not a personal conquest, business model, or political tool, but the centerpiece of Socrates' philosophy. Socrates insisted that he, too, was ignorant of the best definition of virtue, but that his wisdom consisted of knowing that he did not know. However, Socrates did attack the sophist view of conventional morality, which equated human happiness with power and the desire to get more. Organized but informal education started with Socrates' greatest pupil, Plato, who established the Academy in 387 BCE. The Academy was a gymnasium where Greek men would congregate to practice and expand their physical and mental capacity. This was not a school in the modern sense. The Academy was an informal association of people who were interested in studying philosophy, mathematics, and theoretical astronomy with Plato as their guide. Plato saw education as the search for truth, which was free from subjugation by individuals. Truth was objective and could be taught to those who wanted to learn. This philosophy was the focal point that led Plato to establish the Academy, which would come to be so eminent that it would last for centuries as a gathering place for intellectuals. Organized education was furthered with the creation of the Lyceum in 335 BCE by Plato's greatest pupil, Aristotle. Aristotle saw science and philosophy as a tool for knowledge in everyday life instead of being merely a discipline for abstract and esoteric subjects. Still, he spent a great deal of his scientific thought focused on morals and ethics. He found that the essential problem in human morals is the almost universal tendency to want more and the propensity to act unjustly if capable to achieve that end. Therefore, Aristotle thought the purpose of education was to discourage individuals from this desire and abuse of power, which has its worst effects when it's directed at acquiring money or honor. Aristotle, 384 to 322 BCE, was opposed to the educational trend predominant during his lifetime. The sophists made their mark. Persuasive speaking was the most valued skill. The most important subject in his education was rhetoric, the technique of public speaking and argumentation. Alternatively, Aristotle lectured on a great number of subjects, including biology, medicine, anatomy, psychology, meteorology, physics, chemistry, mathematics, music, metaphysics, rhetoric, political science, ethics, and literary criticism. He encouraged his students and followers to become specialists, conducting research in their fields of interest, and he created a system for distinguishing a merely persuasive argument from a logical one. Greek Paideia is an impressive socialization and education system that was responsible for Greece's philosophical and military success. Before investigating the social conditions, it is important to see that classical Greece was a culture of honor, meaning that the society had a strong concern about reputation. This was a concern about one's own self, others, and the polis in general. The latent social function, which manifests itself in the concept of arete, gives individuals ample motivation to perform their best and defend their own, whether it be at the Olympic Games, in everyday life, or on the battlefield. Arete has its own effect on behavioral patterns of Athenian citizenry because it acts as a normative social influence. Normative social influences provide a desire to avoid disapproval, harsh judgments, or social sanctions. Arete, as a desired attribute, not only acts as a deterrent, but encourages social conformity. The attributes of the ancient Greek Paideia system also had many manifest functions which enabled citizens to reach the heights of physical and mental ability. The journey began at age 6 when the relationship between child and pedagogos was starting to develop. The pedagogos acted as a guardian with an authoritative parenting style which allowed the young boys to be adventurous but obedient, so they felt confident and secure with themselves and around others. During this period, the young boys were sharpening their minds and bodies by developing humanity's most notable characteristics: written language, organized sound, and an erect physique. At age 14 to 16, the schooling ended and the boy obtained an apprenticeship. Along with increasing his exercise routine in frequency and intensity, the boy, most likely, developed an intimate relationship with his mentor. This relationship raised the boy's image of his relational self. Relational self is an important self-concept that refers to the way individuals view themselves in terms of their beliefs, feelings, and expectations in relation to other individuals who are significant in their lives. Plato's quote couldn't be a stronger indication of this social anomaly at work on the minds of Greek men. Athenian men became more dedicated in life in general, and especially in the military, by viewing themselves through the eyes of their lover. At age 18, a young Athenian entered into the second stage of life. Age 18 marked the stage in which the youth would be enrolled for training in the Athenian soldier youth. During this period, these young men were subject to constant moral supervision, required to wear an elaborate uniform, and trained for 2 years in the duties of citizenship and war. This might be the most important part of Greek paideia and socialization. Not only are these men receiving further education and training, but this stage started the process that would solidify ambition, integrity, and responsibility through group cohesion and the development of ego. To explain this process, one must understand the self-discrepancy theory, which states that individuals will act appropriately motivated by cultural and moral standards regarding the ideal self and the ought self. The ideal self embodies the dreams and aspirations that an individual and others have about him or herself. The ought self is concerned with the duties and obligations the individual is compelled to honor. This stage of development defined the standards of the ought self and ideal self. Training processes allowed these young men to compare their actual self, who they truly know themselves to be, with the ought self and ideal self. Through this, the training would encourage setting high goals, ideal self, understanding the individual's role in society, ought self, and the realization that through discipline and dedication, the actual self can become the ideal self. At age 19, each youth was assigned to a garrison and entrusted to protect Athens against foreign invasion and civil disorder for 2 years. However, before receiving this honor, they had to make an oath before being trusted to protect the city. They took the following vow in front of the council of 500 with hands extended over the temple. I will not disgrace the sacred arms, nor will I abandon the man next to me, whoever he may be. I will bring aid to the ritual of the state and to holy duties, both alone and in company with many. I will transmit my native commonwealth to lessened, but larger and better than I have received it. I will obey those who from time to time are judges. I will obey the established statuses and whatever other regulations the people shall enact. If anyone shall attempt to destroy the statuses, I will not permit it, but will repel him both alone and with all. I will honor the ancestral faith. This oath truly captures the goals and achievements Paideia accomplished with every Athenian. When the training was complete after those 2 years, at age 21, the young men were then free from parental authority and formally recognized as Athenian citizens. At this point, the Athenian was fully prepared for life and to pursue his personal ambitions. But this conjecture can be made clearer by explaining the theory of planned action. The theory states that the best predictors of deliberate behavior are people's attitudes towards specific behaviors and their beliefs about whether they can successfully perform the behavior in question. By this period in their development, any male Athenian would know what was expected of him and he would pursue his goals accordingly due to the ability to eliminate doubts about his character and ability. Perhaps the most impressive thing about Greek education is the cultural achievements. Greece was fortunate enough to have civil stability, which allowed Arete to blossom into Paideia. Then, Greek citizens saw the community as their collective manifestation, so they wanted to make each individual a masterpiece in order to fulfill their ideal of humanism. This is why all Greeks agreed that education was of the highest importance. The Greeks saw themselves as only a part of the whole, and the whole was the polis. The latent social forces created an education system that would progress from private at the beginning of the classical period to public, to private or public during, and then state-sponsored toward the end and into the Hellenistic period. The manifest forces created a dedicated citizenry that were willing to die for the survival of their Paideia, polis, and fellow citizenry. Greek Paideia is the culmination of immense social forces which compound the individual into conforming to a culture whose ideal is to better the entirety through the individual. It was successful in producing 3 immortal philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Their lineage would inspire an empire created by Alexander the Great, who was taught the ideals of Paideia under Aristotle. The domination and success of Greece during the classical period wasn't attributed to dedicated individuals rising above a dismal society. Rather, it was the educational system itself that gave rise to a golden age of Greece.